If you want to talk about action RPGs, you'll end up looking at Ys in one way or another. So why is it looking at me? Crunchy and dated as it seems, there are earlier examples of action RPGs, but it sprouted directly from that nascent lineage. Dragon Slayer, Xanadu. These prototypal action RPGs were products of a young Nihon Falcom, a company that wouldn't publish a game in North America until the original Ys. Nihon Falcom is a very old company whose development ambitions stretch back to 1982 on the PC-88 and other Japanese home computers, platforms that most modern gamers won't ever access unless they stumble onto a Nintendo Switch port or something similar. I think you'd have to trick people to hit play. And I now understand why classic video games used hand-painted assets to move units. But crusty games or no, I'll do anything for $1, even play PC-88 games. That's just the kind of guy I am. You could trace the action RPG lineage back further still. Panorama Toe is another early Falcom game. Look at that lush jungle. Things are happening here. It's a mishmash of gameplay objectives, but you have hit points, stamina, you equip gear and win gold from fallen foes. Dexterity, action is kind of relevant, which makes Dragon Slayer look futuristic by comparison. Finally, an RPG where you move and kill. Xanadu, Dragon Slayer's direct sequel, is foundational to the genre, and particularly to Ys. Despite being commercially confined to Japan, almost everybody who owned a PC-88 home computer played Xanadu, even if nobody could actually beat the thing. Falcom would hand out physical cards as a reward for those who managed to roll credits. Jesus, guys, offset that shit. Dragon Slayer and Xanadu both featured a fresh kind of action, prototypal bump combat, something commonly attributed to Ys, which only really fleshed the concept out further. Ys isn't complicated. You move, you run into people, they die. But the gradations matter. You can bump a guy in a decidedly uncool way. You can run into a guy and die. Ys has spiritual ties to Frogger in that sense. If you move wrong, you'll end up like yesterday's roadkill. The question is, why should anyone care about Ys? A quick look back at the history of PC RPGs reveals a market that was quickly outpacing the consumer. That is, computer games were getting harder, more complicated, more fiddly, but the buyer base was expanding. Total newcomers entered the market in record numbers, and you weren't going to hand them Xanadu. You want their money, not their blood. And so Ys 1, Ancient Ys Vanished, sometimes called Ys the Vanished Omens, or the Ancient Land of Ys, or even simply Ys, was developed with the concept of kindness in mind. Are you sure about that? In an interview from the very year of Ys's publication, series co-creator Masaya Hashimoto explains that kindness was a fresh direction for the team. Quote, "In our advertisements for Ys, we prominently featured the word kindness. That word signals that, as developers, we assumed the perspective of players, always asking ourselves how to make a game that would be more enjoyable from the player's perspective. Thinking from the player's perspective resonated with newcomers, and the game became immensely popular in a very short period, at least in Japan. It's worth noting that it's possible Ys may never have manifested if not for some development disobedience. Ys was originally intended to be a follow-up to Azteca 2, an adventure game by Falcom, but Hashimoto rigged up a prototype that had real-time scrolling up and down the screen that was built off the bones of Azteca 2. But by then, the concept had shifted so much that Kato had to eventually agree to release the game as Ys. After years of playing the same old AAA schlock, I find myself yearning for weird, interesting takes on the medium from time to time, whether that means friction or novelty, new reasons to stay invested. That means I tend to play harder, more confusing games, but there was a time when confusion was the norm, when games were so brutal and so demanding that something as simple as allowing the player to save anywhere was revolutionary. That shit cost $100 in Xanadu, so games didn't have to be primarily marketed to big-time sweats. Development for Ys took place over a searing 5-month period, and it's not necessarily the length of time that blows me away. You know, dev time inflation is kind of like Big Mac inflation, and That's just business. No, Ys is fascinating because it was developed in part with a number of very young employees of a very young Falcom. Tomoyoshi Miyazaki, who went on to write Terranigma and Planet Laika, among others, was a part-timer at the company and working through his college degree while writing the script for Ys. Yuzo Koshiro, who's credited for the bulk of the score, was only 19 years old. His sister, Ayano Koshiro, who handled manual illustrations, was just 17. Even the lead programmer, Hashimoto, was only 26. There's this vibe underpinning the creation of Ys: young, hopeful, vibrant, fresh ideas for a new generation, kind of piecemeal and figuring things out as it all unfolds. I think that's why Ys feels so charming, despite its incredibly primitive appearance. The dev staff is there, in the protag, running headlong into the future and never stopping. The old PC-88 manual even came with a full backstory breakdown explaining the protagonist and his adventures leading up to the game, things that would be hammered out and worked into later versions. To give an impression of the weight, the importance Falcom wanted to impart, Ys, the PC-88 version, shipped with a hardcover manual, something that's impossible to imagine today. I've purchased modern games. You know what I got? Nothing. An advert if you're lucky. Directions to the digital manual. Suck my dick and balls. Now that's all well and good, but why cover Ys at all? It's simplistic. It's a game about collecting objects and killing an evil man. We've all seen this before, at least 50 times! Well, the original Ys is a bedrock title for Nihon Falcom, and they've carried it along through the decades, occasionally refining the original concept. It was also released at that critical point in Japanese PC gaming history, when multiple home computers competed for market dominance, meaning it was eventually licensed to multiple external developers, who each took a crack at shipping their own version. Ys was the first Falcom game to hit North American shores, meaning a degree of international importance was conferred to this humble, kindness-minded game. In a sense, it's unhelpful to spend too much time focusing on the original development team because the story of Ys 1 was tinkered with, broken down, and built back up enough times to make your head spin by many different teams in many different ways. So, what does it mean to tell the same story 7 times? But first, let me add some personal context. I suffered a hard drive crash during the development of this video and lost 5 full playthroughs of Ys 1. Having already assembled the footage in my video editing software, I was forced to record all 5 games from scratch, bringing the total number of games played to 12. I think I've memorized the layouts of the dungeons. I think I know where Darm Tower is. Not in game, but in real life. Whenever I see a particularly large tree, I think, damn, getting some real Ys vibes here. So welcome to an earnest exploration of what it means to commit to the bit. Yeah, I'm on a ledge. Man, the view is amazing. Ys is the story of adult Kristen, a wanderer with no dialogue, someone for the player to project themselves onto, or someone whose personality you can freely infer from his actions. He's not quite a blank slate, but the finer points are left to interpretation. You know, Buddy gets 3 potential love interests and doesn't go on a single coffee date. What else is there to say? He really cares about his work. Adol crosses the sea to Esteria and finds himself caught up in a prophecy. A fortune teller says she's been waiting for him to arrive. Okay, chosen one narrative. Fairly normal stuff. I guess if everyone around me had regular hair, I'd expect my red-headed ass to be treated like a mythical being, too. Monsters now roam the land, and it's Adol's destiny to collect the 6 books of Ys, banish the darkness, etc., etc. Ys, the first one, doesn't have a particularly compelling story. Its narrative is simple enough that an entirely media-illiterate boob like me can grasp it with ease. Thank God, some of these RPGs got me into library, poring over tomes. There's not much in the way of nuance, at least in early Ys. Adol is self-evidently good, and you kill things that are self-evidently bad. The villain's name is Dark Fact.
The name's Dark Fact.
Dark fact number 1. Dark is not a title he received after becoming evil, but actually his real name. Sometimes I think video games are the only things that matter. You have to remember that Ys released in 1987. RPGs, and particularly action RPGs, weren't known for prioritizing story. A lot of video gaming is interaction. Yeah, it's the interactive medium. It's a culture of action. And game development was fraught with limitations. Space, fidelity, accessibility. Games grew explosively for decades, and it's not hard to see why. So many people, consumers included, became obsessed with the best, the most, the next step into the future. Just compare Dragon Slayer 1 and Xanadu, the progenitor and its sequel, side by side. Yeah, people had high hopes for whatever was coming next. At the time, a plot as simplistic as the one found in Ys might have passed as value. Bang for your buck. Damn, we got characters and gameplay? Oh my god. Of course, you had to find it all yourself, house by house, because there weren't proper cutscenes back in '87. You had to find the text dump. That text dump meant something back then, okay? In the original Ys, you load the game up using floppy disks, listen to the intro theme, hit play, and get dropped in like, okay, who am I though? Most people never see this version of Ys, though, so before we dust off the etchings of the ancients, let's take a look at what new players can expect instead, and where I personally started my journey with the series. The modern take on Ys 1, sold as Ys Chronicles on PC storefronts, is an alien experience. Not in a bad way, just imagine going 30-some years without experiencing Ys combat. Turns out I should have studied the blade. An intro cutscene paints a picture of the scenario without outright explaining it, and you wake up in a small village. You're made to walk around talking to villagers, you read their names, you listen to their problems. You're allowed to wander into the wilderness, but you have no weapons, so it's pretty easy to end up in the same bed you started in. When you eventually get your sword, you find that Adol moves incredibly fast, and enemies occasionally adjust their positions, throwing you off. It's sometimes better to shift gears, slow yourself down before engaging. The 8-way movement is slippery, at least at first touch, and it's a bit too easy to let attacks slip in when you're not confident. You might not have armor yet, you might lack a shield. If you run away after bumping into an enemy, you could eat a retaliatory strike. So combat feels committal. You've got to go in hard and fast. Oh, I always knew that'd come in handy one day. You have to know what you're doing, and I didn't. Ys Chronicles was my first experience with the franchise, and it did surprisingly well at putting me in my place for the first 20 minutes. I heard you were supposed to run into enemies, like, slightly from the side, but I wasn't instantly successful without a weapon, and I thought bump combat was maybe more complicated than I'd heard. But the truth is, Ys is as much RPG as it is action, and that was the misunderstanding. Bump combat is a long-standing concept that's been implemented in different ways in different games, but the reason I struggled on my first Ys outing is simple. I suck at it. I didn't account for the history at play. Ys Chronicles is simultaneously designed as though the player has played and has never played an Ys game. Let me explain. You're given an introductory zone that's meant to contextualize the quest, lend some importance to the denizens of Asteria, establish Adol and his relationship with the place he's saving from a rising tide of evil. But the combat is a much more liquid version of the thing first established all those decades prior. You can bump an enemy from 1, 2, 3, and many more pixels away. But not in the old days. In the original version of Ys, you knew whether you cleanly struck an enemy because you could only stand so many units of measurement askew from their center point at any point. You'd run at an enemy, adjust by 1 unit of measurement, and kill them clean. Movements were predictable, most enemies were slow. The game wasn't just simple, it was designed with visual clarity in mind. Modern Ys believes the player implicitly understands bump combat. On top of Ys's bizarre armor shield level calculations, its inner workings, and asks them to throw themselves fully into danger. While there's some value in that tension, this take on Ys and its mechanics is a symptom of modern hands directing a very old experience. It's just not as good at onboarding as older versions. The very first boss I ever fought in Ys was brutal. I couldn't damage the guy, just chipped away at his enormous health bar. I kept getting roasted by flame jets that persistently refused to give me a window of opportunity. I thought Ys was maybe secretly a hardcore action game, the kind of game where you take 50 cracks at any given boss. So I left, did a little grinding outside the shrine, bought some new equipment, leveled up at least twice, and... What happened? What fucking happened? And that kind of mechanical confusion is only the tip of the iceberg. The original Ys made its home on the PC-88. Various other pre-Windows ports of Ys crept onto other competing home computer systems. The Sharp X1, PC-98, and FM7 versions are practically indistinguishable, minus some display minutia. The MSX2 version is slightly slower, squashed down, but otherwise content identical to the original Ys. None of these constitute a story, and so I avoided them when recording footage. But looking at other versions, things get weird fast. And to play through these many versions, it's important to have a cheat sheet for quick reference. While many versions of Ys differ at a functional level, the plot can be broken down, beat by beat, into the following steps. Walk around the introductory town and surrounding area, buy a shield, sword, and armor any way you can. Speak to the fortune teller who will give you a crystal. Journey through the plains, up and east to Zepik village. Speak to the mayor and agree to find the town's missing silver bells. Speak to Old Lady Jebba for the key to the first dungeon. Head north through the mountain path and ask the thieves about the bells. Enter the first dungeon and kill the first boss. Fight through the dungeon, find the prison key, and free a young woman named Fina. Continue dungeon crawling and kill the second boss. Collect 1 book of Ys. Cheaty piece of shit, I had to work for that. Return to the starting town. The fortune teller is missing. Collect the second book of Ys. Head to the abandoned mine and find the Rhoda seed and the silver harmonica. Return to town and give the harmonica to Rhea. Bring the Rhoda seed to one of the Rhoda trees and receive the silver sword. Fight through the rest of the mine, find the Darm key, and kill the boss to receive the third book of Ys. Return to Zepik and have Jebba translate the books of Ys for you. Ask the thieves for permission to enter Darm Tower. Pray to your impotent god. Climb the tower, get captured, lose your equipment, get freed by Dogi, acquire the idol, and give it to the old man for a necklace that will let you climb further. Fight 2 more bosses for 2 books of Ys. Break a pillar with a hammer to purify a life-draining hallway. Rescue Rhea to obtain the monocle, double back to Luda Gemma to receive the blue amulet, climb, fight 1 more boss, and then fight Dark Fact. Read the books with the monocle, roll credits. This progression core is important to memorize for any Ys scholar because some versions of the game have no English translation, and a solid grasp of the core experience will carry you through regardless. Ys is not an overly difficult game, but it's easy to get caught up in the moment and skip a beat. You're not given any kind of reminder text, you're not following a marker or breadcrumb trail. The game tells you once and you go. Thankfully, Ys is very short, and with any given run capping out at maybe 6 hours tops. You can finish Ys, the Sega Saturn version, and some others in the time it takes to watch this video. Can we make that a speedrun category? Beat Ys 1 before K-Baz shuts the hell up? Yes, that includes the credits scroll, but for bonus points finish it before, so it's rare the player gets seriously lost. Or at least, you'd think so. The real trick is, not every version of Ys agrees on this list of events. The post-Windows remakes of Ys 1, so Ys Eternal, which was expanded on, and Ys Complete, which was finalized in Ys Chronicles, why'd they nerf her ears? All feature the intro town and preliminary zone dividing the player from the game proper. It's not a major addition, only accounting for 20-ish minutes of playtime if you let it. You can talk to every NPC in town and get a free sword from the militia captain. This tiny addition is, in itself, a story. As mentioned, Ys doesn't properly start until the player equips themselves with a sword, a shield, and armor. When you load into the game, you have 1,000 gold. A basic set of equipment will run you 1,600 gold. Nobody hands you any kind of free equipment in the older versions of Ys, meaning the player can buy 1 piece of equipment, a sword, and will be forced to wander the plains grinding money from slain monsters, 600 whole pieces, hopefully arming themselves with the knowledge necessary to tackle the game. However, Knowledgeable players will ask around town and learn that a man at the tavern lost a ring. If you buy the sapphire ring from the local shopkeep for 1,000 gold and hand it to the man, he'll give you 1,500 gold in return, meaning you can buy 2 pieces of equipment before ever setting foot on the field, and grind up a mere 100 gold instead, to deck yourself out and get the plot rolling. This takes about 10 minutes or less, played naturally. Getting a free sword from the militia captain in Ys Chronicles and going through the Sapphire Ring side quest, if you can call it a side quest, will get the player started with the Fortune Teller's quest, the first actual quest, faster than a total beginner might. Only that player needs to know the free sword is available at all for talking to every NPC, and that the Sapphire Ring is indeed the tavern guy's ring, and that such an investment is safe to make early, that they'll be rewarded for taking the plunge. Because you don't know. What if it's a totally different ring? It's not like there's only one kind of ring. You equip rings in Ys. There's 4 of them. Why would someone make that assumption and gamble with their only money? If the player gets the free sword but doesn't bother with the ring, they can buy 1 piece of equipment with their 1,000 gold and be made to grind up a simple 100 gold from enemies. Only we had to go through the introductory scene setting, the wall of text boxes. If the player never gets the free sword and simply runs to town, they're exactly where they'd be if they'd picked any other version of Ys, and whether they handle the Sapphire Ring or not comes down to experience. It's a weird thing to play through, playing them back to back. It never occurred to me to talk to every NPC on my first Chronicles run, even when prompted to talk to the villagers, because what? Jarvis herds sheep. I don't care what he says. You're left to move forward at your own discretion. NPCs have names, but they aren't interesting people, and I'm left thinking that the older method was better. You blew in or blipped in and you handled it. Critically, you weren't immediately helpless against the enemies in the field because you could buy a sword instantly, so that friction never happened. There's no shop in that Chronicles intro town, you know? So in shaping the world, contextualizing Asteria, the story of Ys changes. The tone changes. The new way, old way, neither are inherently better. They're just interesting flavors of the same basic story. Also, for people in the know, you can haggle down the Sapphire Ring to 900 gold. In modern remakes specifically, return the ring and buy all 3 pieces of equipment in one big go. Speedrun viable. I love video games. Once you're equipped, you're let loose into the world. You're technically free from the outset. Nothing is stopping the player, in most of the games, from leaving whatever starting point and running all the way to the second dungeon, the Abandoned Mine, and dying instantly. Nothing is stopping the player from running off to Zepik Village and up the mountain path, though you'll need to deal with the main quest to actually enter the first dungeon. But regardless, the world is mostly open. It's a small place in most versions, green grassy fields, lakes, forests, the type of thing you'd see in Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, Fantasyland. A few notable landmarks exist, the towns, the mine, and a pair of very large trees. Otherwise, the magic of Ys is lower key to start, and mostly wrapped up in the wood elementals and other monsters roaming the plains. It's unremarkable in most versions, function over form, but for something so paint by numbers, it's been cast in so many different molds. The original was pretty quick to jog through. It's one of Ys's strengths. Players never had to worry about backtracking. Not really, because you're very rarely put in a position you can't escape from. The game isn't terribly large. You never have to stop. You choose whether to engage any given enemy. You run as fast or faster than most of them. They're not homing missiles in every version. And keying into the idea of kindness, Ys lets Adol's HP regenerate over time, as long as the player is standing still. Something seen in Hydlide before, sure, but few games of the era otherwise. It's preeminently playable. Always exciting, because you can pause whenever you need, you can heal off the damage while taking a deep breath, taking the garbage out, and jump back into the action in seconds. This kind of gameplay framework, coupled with the uplifting field music and bright visuals, makes for a smooth, forward-flowing, and even triumphant experience. You want to keep playing. You don't need to 100 times because you're there. Let's go! I make videos about video games for a living, and I do it pretty consistently too. Sometimes my hand hurts. I mash a lot of buttons. I use my mouse more than any responsible person. I swap between an ergonomic mouse and a regular mouse to shake up what I'm doing to my body. I fix a lot of tiny problems with my audio and do a lot of gritty detail stuff while editing. Sometimes my hand hurts and I did it to myself. You know why I like Ys? You don't need to constantly engage your right hand to play. Most of the time you can freehand it. That's a blessing. That is kindness-minded design. Hashimoto, I kneel. Modern versions are even more carefree. 8-way movement lets you dodge anything unless you're confined, and increased disk space lets the developers expand the field. Suddenly you have room to maneuver. And it takes longer to backtrack, sure, but it's also sized appropriately for a continent-saving adventure. And Adol moves real fast. Sure, he doesn't have much for canon personality here, but he'd probably make a good addition to Burnout. The world and its simplistic construction, its bright palette, is narratively important to the game. That fiery shonen's running fast, and he's ready to jump the evil. So when you load into another version of Ys, you might be surprised by the changes. The Famicom version is a whole story in itself. The starting town, Mine, because of the nearby mine. Do you, have a condition? Is more intricate, decorated, and the colors are bright, but there's a persistent uncanniness to the game. Adol moves significantly slower. His health regenerates slower. Combat has less wiggle room. The game runs smooth, there's no choppy movement, but that actually makes it harder at times, especially with input delay, to correctly position yourself to kill cleanly. The screen transitions in an unsafe way. It isn't centered, so you're constantly in striking distance of newly drawn enemies. You level up to a cap of 24 instead of 10. The 8-bit music is slightly eerie. It's all the same tunes, but off, and it reflavors the experience just enough. Even with the blazing hues, there's an emphasis on harsh black that seeps into the visuals, makes them darker than you might expect, and it persists into various overworld and dungeon segments. Famicom Ys feels weird. It feels unnatural, and it's not bad by any means. I thought it made the game unsafe and kind of epic in a way I wasn't expecting. It keyed into the idea that darkness permeates the land, and its most fascinating change is the overworld. This version of the game was developed by Advanced Communication Company and published by Victor Musical Industries, neither of which had a hand in the original version. It was released in 1988, 1 year later, and the totally separate development staff had their own ideas about Ys. Suddenly, the overworld features statues that teleport the player to an entirely new area, which has no effect on moment-to-moment play, but you can wander off on a whim while scouring the field and find a big lake with no apparent purpose. However, when you return from the first dungeon, you'll find your progress gated. There's no way to enter the mine. So you find out, whether through trial and error or listening to NPC dialogue or a guide, that you need to find some kind of water spirit. So you head back through the teleporting statues and approach the lake. She pops out and asks you to find her staff, which she lost in town. You head back to town, dig around in the well, and return the staff. She'll hand you a flute as payment and tells you to use it on a group of trees.
Okay.
So you find some oddly placed trees, approach, and some invisible thing, a voice, maybe what was once supposed to be an NPC of some kind. It tells you that it can help you. The staff is recharged, which you did not hand back to the water guardian, I guess, and approaching the lake, blocking off the mine, will evaporate the water, finally letting you pass. Famicom Ys is weird. None of that happens in other versions of Ys. You just go. You just go to the mine. The changes reek of external input, trying to tweak something that wasn't broken, right? Complicate it for the sake of the quest. Adol can't just wander off to the mine and find a bunch of items in advance. No, he's got to talk to the spirits and wander around. He needs to enlist the help of the supernatural. That's just good questing. Maybe it was a push to increase the game's length. Maybe it was meant to make Adol's adventure more recognizably epic. Maybe it was meant to, in some small way, evoke Zelda. The Famicom version changes are sweeping. I could spend 20 minutes going over each of them and what they mean, but we were talking about the map, the world of Ys. And the Famicom version isn't the only one with opinions and alterations. Earlier versions don't change very much, but consider the Sega Master System version. Aside from featuring fewer enemies to fight, making grinding a bit of a chore, the developers made the inexplicable decision to alter the dungeon layouts, but not in any significant way. While these layouts are basically identical in most versions of the game, the Master System version often mirrored them, left to right or up to down. The item placement doesn't meaningfully change, the experience is fundamentally intact, but they decided to make a few Ys old heads very confused when they walked into whatever dungeon. But it doesn't take nearly as many liberties as the Famicom version. It's different, but safe. Never mind, that is the scariest Ys has ever been. Turn that off. Want to see something really unhinged? Let's talk peak Ys. Oh, hey, Ys was ported to the Sharp X68000, which I'm sure we've all heard of before. This version is so obscure it's omitted from the Moby Games page. The Sharp X68000 was a higher fidelity machine than Ys was traditionally ported to, and that gave the developers room to create something completely original. It even had key art drawn by Yoshitaka Amano. Gaze upon that ethereal, painterly aesthetic and be transported to another world. It looks exactly like an actor, but I can't tell which. This version of Ys departs both visually and structurally from the traditional experience. Gone are the carefully sprited portraits, that lighthearted anime aesthetic, replaced by what I can only describe as the hardcore Western art enjoyers' take on how Ys should look. Okay, enough of this anime stuff. It's unconvincing, it's ugly, and it goes beyond the portraits. This console is capable of bigger sprites, more moving objects, it's more powerful overall. But the minute you walk outside, you're bombarded, barraged, pelted with dudes. I feel like I'm battling the forces of Mordor here, and this works, in a sense. Ys has moments that require grinding, genuinely require grinding, not like, oh, you're not engaging with the core mechanic. No, like, actually, you have to stop and kill, usually because you haven't been killing enough. Of course, that's if you run through a little too quickly, and the Sharp version makes finding enemies a breeze. They find you. They're locked on your position. You're gonna get trampled if you don't hold a direction. Fight or die. Once you've caught a breath by leveling up and loading out, you'll find Zepik the smallest possible distance away, a light jog to the northeast. What? The map is puny. It's a fraction of what it's supposed to be. What is going on here? Sharp X68000 Ys? Why does this game take place on Namek? It's a bizarre mishmash of styles, realistic portraits coupled with cartoony character models. The sprited world looks bizarre. The package is visually incongruent. I don't like to look at it. The colors are faded, but not in a way that lends any kind of character to the experience. Instead, earth and stone becomes a washed out clay. And this is great for highlighting where the player character is. You're never going to lose sight of that shade of red. But a game is greater than its mechanics, and the aesthetic never quite comes together. Most of the outdoor areas are cropped versions of themselves. You waltz up the mountain path expecting some normalcy, but no. It's a short left and right walkway. Man, the Famicom version had all these weird additions, a series of trapeze-like chains connecting to the Thieves' Lair. This is the barest possible minimum. You don't even need to navigate a single dungeon floor to fight the first boss. Just open the door and... oh my god, a bitmap! Color is important to Ys. Aesthetics in general, really. But the Sharp version features this beautiful hue to simulate dusk, only to mirror the setting sun. The water surrounding the temple becomes stark orange. It looks like lava. It's lava, dude! It was so jarring. Finishing up with the mines, final boss room full of lava, then approaching the final dungeon, only to be met with this effect like, damn, Dark Fact turned the world's water to lava. What a villain. Oh, that's the sun. Why? This is easily the most interesting visual reinterpretation of Ys. It aligns in no way with the plot, the narrative, the intention, and chooses to do something completely different, whether for the sake of being original or sincerely trying to do right by the game using superior technology while slicing the foundation to ribbons. It's a fascinating study in adaptation, or like maladaptation. I guess there was never much to go on for developers trying to capture the world of Ys. It was fantasy. It was bright, blindingly bright. But it's not hard to recreate Fantasyland, so people did. That said, video games are about more than the explicit visuals. They're also about what the other elements at play, the style, the palette, and the music, the aesthetic core, lend to the gameplay core, how these elements create a narrative in conjunction with the play. The sharp version makes the quest feel frantic and rushed and even unkind. NPCs rarely smile, they present more grim than pleasant. This version doesn't even feel like Ys, doesn't tap into its core proposition of kindness, except that some of the bosses are easier. And by the way, muted palettes aren't some kind of artistic betrayal. Early Ys is bright, sure, but plenty of Ys ports do very little with the overworld, only changing the palette and stylizing the basic pieces that make up the traditional layout. Ys on the Sega Saturn, which was packaged in the Falcom Classics collection and constitutes the first proper Falcom remake of Ys, maintains the core of the experience with no fundamental alterations. The environments are more or less the same, the dungeon layouts are faithful, the progression is entirely recognizable, but it's been painted over, recast in these forlorn, pastoral tones. It's a game about a single hero picking up a sword and saving the world. A human fighter with no special abilities yet, and the visuals change to reflect that narrative reality. It's grounded, it's familiar despite being such a far cry from the original version. Modern Ys remakes take this general approach as well, but with the lightest touch of something ethereal, misty areas and heightened drama, heightened magic, where it's called for anyway, because Ys is a fantasy game, and it should have something suggesting it beyond the monsters. The world is mystical, and you're unraveling a mystery about the ancient kingdom of Ys, a civilization that vanished from Asteria long before the player blows in. Plot-mandated girlfriends. Okay, Johnny come lately. So build that mystery into the visuals, into the world. That's probably why the Famicom version has a water guardian and teleportation statues. The original Ys isn't all that mystical. There's a couple big trees, which, when approached with a seed, might spit out a sword. Doesn't quite hit the same as pulling a legendary blade from a stone, you know? The best you'll find in most versions is a golden vase, which spawns in different spots in different games, but always in the lake. There's no real indication the vase is there, and it sells for a high enough price to buy something nice early on, and even this puny dab of color in a fairly flat world doesn't appear in every game. It's notably absent from the Famicom version. It's always the Famicom version. This is all to say that Ys was liquid. Other people tried to interpret it in their own myriad ways, but nobody really nailed any kind of unique prevailing identity. Ys is what you imagine it is. Ys is whatever you played through. When you break down Ys into places you spend the most time in, instead of, every individual plot point, Ys is really a series of 3 dungeons and some setting on the side. The field may take up a lot of space, in most versions anyway, but it isn't the bulk of the game. The shrine, the mine, and Darm Tower are functionally Ys. That and all the killing you get up to along the way. They're not incredibly intricate, at least the first 2, and you can blaze on through with a little mechanical knowledge, though you probably want to meticulously scour every floor. If you don't, you might miss treasure chests, and frankly, you need everything you can find. In most versions of Ys, the first dungeon involves a series of light challenges that illustrate the experimental early nature of the game. The things established here are the kinds of dungeon challenges we see years later in other games. You walk into the dungeon, some chests are locked and others aren't. You're gonna need to come back. You find a key partway through that opens every chest. You find another key in a chest that allows you to free Fina from a cell. Dragon Quest also had the player rescue a young woman from a dungeon and physically carry her home, but that was 86. She was handed to the player for killing a boss. In Ys, you had to find her in the world, independent of boss monsters, and open her cell. It's not much, but it's an attempt at grounding the player and the characters in the setting. In post-Windows remakes of Ys, Chronicles, etc., the devs recognized how bizarre it is that you let this jailed woman leave on her own in a monster-ridden world, and so you're asked to guide Fina out of the cell and escort her through the monster-filled dungeon. Why would the game give me an achievement for cornering Fina and making her uncomfortable? What did they mean by this? You have to act as a hero throughout the segment, the escort recontextualizes the gameplay of Ys from aggressive to defensive, and lets you take a breath after going so hard for 30-40 minutes. These are the kinds of changes that alter the flow a bit, change up the pace, but realistically, the player needs to shop anyway, and maybe talk to some NPCs, and now they've got an excuse that's more convincing than, "I just really wanted a better sword, man." I know this is small, but I want to highlight how the tiniest additions can add color, a spark to the experience. It's why characters have portraits, and even voice dialogue when the developer can spring for it, like the TurboGrafx version of Ys.
Are you here to rescue me? How wonderful it would be to escape these chains.
All told, Ys is a pretty lonely game for the first 2 dungeons. It's lacking a certain human element that these little visual and audio flares help balance, and it's probably why you're made to leave partway through both of them. You don't just grind it all out, you reconnect with the people you're helping. The shrine is a well-constructed way to break into Ys otherwise. While the sharp X68000 version is weird, instantly fighting a boss on entry, it's not actually all that strange. The first level of the dungeon has no other enemies in any other version, so the subtraction makes sense. It's mostly extraneous space and some treasure chests. You know after fighting the first boss whether you're ready to handle the next floor. If you lost, you're grinding. If you won, go ahead. The second floor offers up a specific challenge: hallway bump combat. Without the openness of the planes, you're suddenly locked in and forced to fight. Enemies can march forward in single-file corridors that turn off your ability to cleanly kill them. If you try, you'll be knocked back and take damage. The level design directly challenges your mastery of bump combat and your spatial understanding. Suddenly, you have to ram forward regardless of the health penalty, or double back and fight on more favorable terrain. But enemies can spawn from multiple points, and now you have to consider who's approaching first, if you can quickly ram ahead and take one out and create more ground to fight, which kinds of enemies are faster, which have more health, which are more lethal. You're taught to prioritize these things under frantic conditions, something you've already done in the field but with significantly more wiggle room. The second floor of the shrine teaches you combat for the rest of the game. Of course, different versions handle this differently. Some simply don't spawn as many enemies, and some spawn probably too many, but overall, the intention remains across the Ys One-averse. I want to pause for just a moment to explain something about bump combat. Bump combat is not the same experience in every version of Ys. I think the original version is pretty intuitive. You adjust, you move, you kill. Other versions, like the TurboGrafx version, for example, give you a wide berth when you engage in combat. If you cleanly strike someone, enemies are pushed back just enough to allow you to, in real time, correct your position to kill without consequence. Some of the older versions don't really give the player enough breathing room to cleanly kill enemies. The Famicom version, notably, is harder to engage with immediately based on control limitations and how the game actually functions under the hood. The Sharp 68000 version is a little too rapid to feel like you're truly in control of. And versions of Ys from the Saturn to Chronicles, the most modern versions by Falcom specifically, have a level of mechanical liquidity to them that is not present in older versions. The 8-way movement cracks the entire paradigm wide open, allowing the player to make many more errors, but also allowing the player to do more things. Like, for example, in Chronicles, you can infinitely run an enemy into the wall, something you can't do in other games. Some of the versions are still really challenging in places, but allow you to, maybe unintentionally, walk sideways into a wall in perpetuity, which turns your character's hitbox on, so when enemies approach into you, they take damage and you're effectively impervious to any kind of crackback. Playing any individual version, you find ways to understand and abuse the unique mechanics present in that particular game. Even bosses, which tend to look functionally identical, play entirely differently. In the most modern versions of Ys, you simply bounce off of them like it's bumper cars, where in older versions you really have to particularly aim where you're hitting or you're taking a pile of damage for free, sometimes dealing none in return. I guess when it came time to make a modern version of Ys 1, they wanted to streamline the experience and make it intuitively understandable for anyone walking in. I just don't think they nailed it necessarily as well in every way as the older versions. Artifacts of old game design. One of those little artifacts of game design past is the Mask of Eyes, found in a chest in the shrine. It has no other function than revealing hidden doors, and at the cost of hiding all enemies until the mask is removed. You have to know where the secret doors are located to make this item painless. And for someone playing years ago, the mask might as well be a torture device. Of course, I played the game so many times I knew where the very few hidden doors were, so it was never a problem. But it got me to consult a walkthrough the first time anyway. It's why I like to avoid making hard declarations like, Ys 1 is easy. Maybe so, but it's got plenty of different kinds of challenge between having to intuit where the developers might choose to place a door, ramrodding through the levels to find them with the mask equipped, or outright quitting because you can't figure out how to advance and you have no regular guide access, because you're some guy in 1987 and the internet is new. Mercifully, it only shows up again for a single door in the final dungeon. It's actually kind of fascinating for that, by the way. You'd figure they'd hide shit all over the place, but they don't, and acknowledge that the item sucks. It's a chore to bother with, and it only serves to dampen the game's forward momentum. While the shrine doesn't fundamentally change and doesn't offer any kind of stiff challenge outside of bosses, the Famicom version decided to tack on an ending room that fleshes out the dungeon a little better. You get this hallway lined with statues and powerful enemies. They're tough. The Famicom version is sharper and slower in general, and so it takes the opportunity to heighten the tension, and succeeds. It's a memorable room in a game that kind of passes you by, makes the shrine seem slightly more ancient, regal. Health regeneration is only available to the player outside, meaning you're stuck slogging it out, actively preserving hit points throughout any given dungeon, unless you find a health potion or feel like backtracking. Putting a room that directly threatens the player is both a tightening of the valve, but also honesty. The bosses of Ys, as illustrated by my first failed run, require the player to stock up on the best possible equipment and grind to a competitive level. Some bosses, especially in the early game, can be totally trivialized by taking the time to level up and buying stronger gear. Getting to the end of the shrine, fighting the centipede boss and dying against this confusing, mechanically bizarre enemy would probably be infuriating, maybe enough to force a rage quit. So this room is a warning, and it does its job well. That's one dungeon down, and it was more of a tutorial, a training ground than anything else. Now that the devs have thrown just about every kind of beat-by-beat challenge we'll experience for the rest of the game, they have to find another way to raise the stakes. The abandoned mine has no teleportation statues or hidden doors. It's just dark. Not like nighttime dark, like Fire Emblem Fog of War dark.
Advanced darkness.
Which turns out to be a pretty good way to raise the stakes. Bump combat with vision? Not a problem. Bump combat blind? Oh, fuck. I hate the mine. You'd think I would have burnt myself out playing one game so many times, hitting all the same beats, but instead, I just felt a lingering sense of dread when approaching the mine. Ys is a challenging game when you aren't numerically competitive with whatever new area you stumble across, and that's important. It's not that darkness is some insurmountable obstacle, it's that a weird jittering freak is a single second away from running you through. Really, it's an issue of progression, core to the RPG side of Ys, but again, it has narrative value. Running through, the player will notice that at some point, older enemies, monsters from previous zones, or higher dungeon floors are suddenly so weak that there's no need to position yourself correctly, no need to respect the bump combat. Leveling in Ys is drastic, highly polarizing. You go from being unable to damage a boss completely to wiping it off the face of the earth, at least with the early ones. The equipment, swords, shields, armor, rings, can alter your stats as well, but not as drastically. Leveling, in most cases, is more important. Experience is greater than gear. Dogi Man. You even need a sword? That's why Sora didn't need the key. Because it was in his heart. In modern versions, you're not able to grind experience off of random enemies if they're not of the same part of the game that you're supposed to be, or further. You can't grind weak enemies forever. This means that on top of all the other little mechanical quirks that keep Ys fresh, fast, and perpetually moving forward, XP gains incentivize it. It's a bit like climbing stairs. You start out unsure, tiptoeing around enemies, wary of instant death, minding your health, but once you finally reach the next level plateau, you're free to kill anything around you with relative ease. You have peace of mind that you're supposed to be here, doing this thing. That's great for keying into the idea of destiny set up by the fortune teller, but also great for portraying Adol as a burgeoning, growing adventurer. He's constantly running into new challenges. Is that a fucking skin? Having a bit of trouble at first, learning, and gaining competence. Ys is relentless about this point, purely through its mechanics. I think this is part of what Toshihiro Kondo, the current president of Falcom, meant when he described players inferring things about Adol. Nobody says he's an eternally persistent twerp, but he kind of is, if the play experience is taken as literal. So the mine is challenging because of the game's staircase level gating, and annoying because of the darkness. It really wouldn't be the mine without it, just like the poo-poo plays. If anything, the darkness masks the incredibly boring interior. It also masks treasure. Ys is pick-up focused, by the time you've played it once and pick up another version, you're not entering the mine giddy to level up. You want the Rhoda Seed so you can get your silver sword, and you want the silver harmonica so the bard can play a song at you. Check this shit out. And good luck combing every inch of the death-concealing shadows for every item. The shrine was a breeze by comparison. You could see those things. You knew when you missed something. But brute-forcing progress isn't so bad, or hasn't been bad so far. The mine is packed with deadly monsters, though, so you need an ace up your sleeve. Earlier on, the player is given a ring for dealing extra damage and a ring for having incoming damage, and those can get you through a bit further. But what if there were a magical ring that slowed the flow of time? I'm kidding. The timer ring sucks. I'm not 80 years old, man. I still have reactions. But good on you, Falcom, for developing to the elderly, who managed to get partway through the abandoned mines for your accessibility feature. But hold on a minute. Ys, for the Sharp 68,000's timer ring, is uniquely useful because the game is designed with so many enemies and at such a speed that it can just be regularly useful. And on top of that, multiple Darm Tower encounters are so blazingly fast, it's actually almost necessary to equip the timer ring, unlike almost every other version of the game. The real star is the heal ring. Ys scared the player into locking in by the second floor of the shrine. You can't just stand around and heal. It only works outside. So when you finally grab the heal ring and recover that ability to regenerate in dungeons, everything kind of clicks into place. You've been turned into a scrapper by the gameplay, by the level design itself. And now you have all the tools you need. Just mind your levels. It's not a perfect thing, right? Different versions of Ys feature different kinds of enemy spawns, so you'll think you're safe healing up in the darkness when... It's a really funny game. Players who successfully plumb the mine will have access to a fourth tier of equipment, the silver set. You find a shield in the shrine, the armor in the mine, and the sword from the Rhoda tree once you've used the Rhoda Seed and approached.
It is time for you to learn the sacred knowledge. This is what a prostate massage feels like.
Silver might tip the player off early. If they're paying attention, they'll realize they also picked up a silver harmonica and handed it to the bard in Mynia, who looks suspiciously similar to Fina. Aren't a lot of blue hairs around these parts. Like, Adol's the weird one here. Maybe there's a connection between the silver and the blue hair people. Multiple mentions of silver come up in conversation. When you ask the thieves if they took Zeppic Village's silver bells, which ward off monsters, by the way, they'll say no, and in fact, someone stole all of their silver goods anyway.
Someone has stolen all our silver goods. We can't figure out the reasoning behind such an atrocity.
Man. You said it, man. If someone's collecting as much silver as they can and ferreting the stuff away in monster-infested dungeons, silver must be relevant, therefore, to whoever is powerful and cunning enough to do that. Of course, there's one version of Ys that completely does away with the mine's unique challenges, and some other ones. A version so cursed even Dark Fact himself trembles in fear of its malignant evil. Ys for the Nintendo DS is a modern-era remake in the vein of Ys Chronicles. Intro segment, expanded planes, but crushed down into the twin squares. Oh yeah, little thing. You use buttons to attack! So, bump combat is still present via the stylus. You can kind of play Ys how it was intended, but buttons completely upend the dynamic. Why not use the buttons? Aside from the DS's thumb-piercing D-pad, you don't have to move forward to kill anyone. You can let enemies filter through corridors and towards you, entirely removing that scrappy bump combat vibe. This changes everything. Forward momentum is no longer relevant to combat, meaning the forward-flowing nature of the play is sucked away. Adol doesn't mechanically read as this hot-blooded go-getter anymore. Now he can be a passive participant in combat. He doesn't have to be Adol, he can be Link. You no longer need to worry about positioning against bosses. No need for precision skimming or figuring things out spatially. Just wait for an opportunity and rack up the hits. The DS version of Ys, does not respect the core Ys concept. It's willing to cede what made the game unique and interesting for the sake of, presumably, making it even easier or expanding its total accessibility, its total appeal, and having a reason to actually use the face buttons. I'm not against accessibility or alternative control schemes, but when your cool new feature actively erodes the only reason anyone really wants to play old Ys in the first place, its entire mechanical identity, one that actually adds a layer of narrative weight to the experience, I can only politely call it wrong-headed. And it extends beyond the control scheme. The Mine has minimal fog, so little it doesn't impact play. You can see where enemies are, you're never taken by surprise. And you've got the second screen with its little map display, so you never need to worry about learning the layout and getting lost. I can imagine a young person actually writing this out with pen and paper. No longer. The modern remakes, Chronicles, etc., at least attempt to retain what Ys is. Don't peer down their nose at the thing and try to correct it. This is exactly what I'm talking about when I criticize modern hands handling old art. I don't like sneering and condescending like, clearly someone didn't understand the art of Ys. It's not a lot to understand. Ys is very simple, but it's also pretty self-evident what the value and challenge of the second dungeon is. So no mechanical identity and no innate challenge to the second whole dungeon. What are we doing here? Speaking of challenge and modern hands, the Famicom version is not the only version of Ys to tack on new segments. Ys does too. It adds a whole extra dungeon, a whole new tier of equipment that kind of gets jammed between the third tier and silver sets, so it doesn't matter hardly at all. And here's the kicker, okay? They made this labyrinthine hedge maze level with teleportation and switches. Okay, cool. It's like the shrine and the mine in a way, a big maze that you can easily get lost in, making up for its surprisingly small size. It's a bunch of free experience to soften the leveling curve between the shrine and the mine. And it's pretty, it's cute, awesome. But Ys was already constructed fine, enough so that the game is completely playable in its original form, to say nothing of the piles of ports that came after. But no, this one needs an extra bit of leveling. The player can't experience any kind of gameplay friction because that's not Ys. If you think I'm being unfair here, let me be clear. They added a hedge maze dungeon to a port with a freely accessible, pre-drawn map. And I'm supposed to be normal about that. Even the new boss abides by completely different standards. Instead of allowing that critical wiggle room to get hits in, or get hit back, provide some mechanical liquidity to the experience, as many of the Ys bosses do, this one is entirely untouchable until his attack pattern is done. You wait, run in, punish, and back up. It's close. But it's the exact kind of thing you expect from a version willing to crop out the confusion, the mystery. This is Ys, directed by someone who doesn't really have anything to say about Ys. After clearing the mine, collecting 3 books of Ys, and getting them translated by Jebba, we're free to enter Darm Tower, the final dungeon. Only this is weird. The game is 3 dungeons long, but I'm watching this Ys long play video, and it says entering Darm Tower is only the halfway point. Darm Tower is Ys, in a sense. It's the defining experience, the thing that solidly establishes Adol as a hero, the most challenging segment of the game. the origin of classic characters and franchise-running jokes. Darm Tower is the prank the game pulls on the player for diligently sticking it out through 2 major dungeons and learning every last lesson they teach. I don't know. I don't know at all. What do you think it is? Maybe it's like a mountain. Maybe it's a mountain at all. In most versions of Ys, Darm Tower is inescapable, as in, you can't leave the dungeon, you're locked in, surviving on whatever monster flesh at all can rustle up, turning feral and deranged as the days pass. In versions with the wing item, which can teleport the player to Mine, the head of the thieves will take it away from you before entry. Hey man, that's wide. And he tells you that using the wing would end with you splattered on the walls because of some kind of magic imbued in the tower. Reassuring. That really made me comfortable when you said that. Darm Tower is infamous for plenty of reasons, but the most mundane is basic traversal. The thing stretches 25 floors up, and that means a whole lot of dungeon crawling, a whole lot of fighting, and a whole lot of healing. Standing still, letting that inflated health bar tick back to normal. Ys already lightly traumatized the player and expects a little application of knowledge gained. Strap in, or it's the strap on. Of course, Darm Tower wouldn't be interesting as a straight gauntlet to the end goal. Oh no. Early on, you're barred from advancing by a magic seal that ends with you locked up in a dungeon and stripped of your silver equipment. They just take it. If you're on the DS version, no worries, that extra tier of equipment is fine to fall back on. But otherwise, you're stuck with your tier 3 gear, and that's early game stuff. It's wild. You're stuck in a cell with this guy Luda Gemma. That is, until... Dude! A peasant! You're freed by the Missing Thieves Guild guy alluded to previously. He hands you an idol to hand to an old man, but hey, there's no old man. Well, what the fuck? The, Darm Tower is half the game thing is starting to make more sense. So we're tapping into our whole skill set, solving problems with previously relevant items and making connections. We're surviving without heals in dangerous rooms thanks to a ring. We're blazing up the tower floors with renewed purpose and vigor. Oh yeah, buddy, we're gaming. Most versions of the tower are functionally identical. You always fail to advance without an equipable necklace, and a guy always breaks you out of jail by demolishing the wall. Your name isn't Colin. Your name is Doggy. The events are always so similar, and yet Darm Tower is the penultimate Ys challenge, trumped only by Dark Fact. It's the longest and most persistent form of test presented to the player, so the many versions of Ys have different takes on the tower as well. Consider our good friend, the Famicom version. Here, you're free to enter and leave the tower at your leisure, unlike any other version. Even stranger, Famicom Ys' Darm Tower is one big, continuous climb with no regular balconies of any kind, a key aesthetic feature found in every other version of Ys. This means that while the player is free to leave, to heal up, to buy items, not that you want to, the player is also unable to recover mid-dungeon without the heal ring. And even then, they're made to take their chances with roving enemies or clearing a room first. It releases one pressure valve while tightening another, and that's interesting. It could be that the NES couldn't handle more assets, couldn't fit all the necessary balconies, couldn't make room for the long shaft of Darm Tower, or the development schedule couldn't account for a more traditional layout. Either way, Famicom Ys is a true original in the lineup of versions, going so far as to remove key aesthetic markers of its source material. It's like Mickey Mouse without the buttons. What the fuck is that? Otherwise, Darm Tower is usually handled in a very specific way. There's some big think brain design going on here, okay? You can't often progress to a new chunk unless you have the right item. The evil ring for the annex, the necklace for floor 6 and up, the rod for the mirror maze, cueing you into the off-route annex in the first place. Chests mostly appear exactly where they're supposed to, rooms retain the same gimmicks. You know, you have to walk through and immediately back through the same teleporting mirror to advance in the mirror maze, and when you've got it memorized, the entire segment ceases to be a challenge. Monsters still burst through the wall at this one point, and version after version, man, you don't even have to fight them. You can just let them run amok, pass anyway, grab the flame sword, and leave. They're not even worth experience at this point. In most versions of the game, the player could very well hit level cap before the end of the abandoned mine, because the boss of that dungeon is really hard, and the game allows you to grind that much. It's one of the great mysteries of Ys, and likely why they often package the games together now as Ys 1 and 2, why it's more common to experience the titles back-to-back in one big run. Ys's progression feels like a bit of an afterthought, a product of its incredibly brisk 5-month dev cycle. There's no real reason for the player's level to max out where it does, limiting your HP to 255 and massively disincentivizing all potential combat in the final dungeon of the game. You know, the final half, sometimes final third, of the game. Imagine a Final Fantasy game where you can freely ignore the final dungeon's enemies and run all the way to the end boss. Imagine a mana game where you flee from every fight before the final encounter because you don't really feel like it. That's what Ys feels like before or partway through Darm Tower. That's what most versions of Ys encourage, purely by the numbers. It's kind of unhinged. The versions that bridge the first two Ys games attempts to fix this by increasing the level cap, and so progression fundamentally alters. It creates more, that was really easy, and wow, that was insanely hard moments than you'd expect, because the original version and its numbers were handled how they were, and that core structure can't retroactively anticipate future changes without a total statistical overhaul. When I say Ys is basically easy, I mean it can be if you're the right level for where you need to be, and you have to have the right equipment, because otherwise, Ys can be pretty brutally hard. And the way it's designed, you'd think Ys were more of a boss rush game than an action RPG, you know, because the bosses are the only real fights after a point that you must engage with. Boss enemies are an entire rabbit hole, but if you're this far along, you either need the largest volume of esoteric knowledge beamed directly into your skull, or like, you don't have a lot going on today? Good for you. Sorry, Adol. Did I wake you up? What do you think? So as we know, early boss enemies can be trivialized by simply out-leveling and out-equipping them. There's no need to learn the first boss fight, only a need for a thick stack of cash. And it's payday, motherfucker. This problem mostly disappears by the end of the mine. The vampire boss might as well be a Darm Tower boss. You need full silver equipment and a good level to meaningfully tip the scales. Otherwise, he just rips through your health pool. After this fight, the rest of the game mostly assumes you're combat viable. Yes, there's an additional tier of equipment above silver, but it doesn't warp the experience over much, just makes a handful of the bosses more immediately survivable. Because yeah, like in most versions, you can't gain any more levels after a point, meaning the Darm Tower boss battles are the closest thing to intentionally balanced encounters in Ys. So, how does Ys handle boss design? The first boss, Jen Okers, doesn't do anything in most versions of the game, opting to vanish and reappear while jets of flame burst from the walls, making the only real hazard the environment. The boss is a test of mobility, prioritizing the roots of the action play before even considering something as advanced as specific bumps. You still need to ram the guy, only it's more like dashing up and tagging him once before he disappears, nothing too challenging. And it teaches you that you need to stay moving against boss enemies because those flames will kill you in seconds if you hang around like a bad MMO raider. Of course, the different approaches to level balance tend to make this boss more of an obnoxious fly than a real challenge for many Ys playthroughs. Like I said, Ys is whatever version you played. Famicom Ys, my favorite bullying victim, couldn't draw too many moving objects at the same time, or doing so would have tanked performance, and so the bosses are changed to compensate. The first boss actually bothers to attack you. That's amazing! While all the other versions are taking a vacation, darting through flames and jerking off, poor NES Janokers is earning his dark fact paycheck and shooting his own damn fireballs. It captures the spirit of the fight. You still need to stay highly mobile to keep up with the guy as he phases in and out and keep a healthy distance from the fire, but you're much more in control, something that's often entirely thrown out the window for this fight. The Chronicles version is just untouchable for seconds and seconds until they turn into minutes, unless you're overpowering the guy. It's like it wants me to break it over my knee. You enjoying this badass music while waiting for the light to turn green? I didn't think they could make a traffic stop into a boss fight, but here we are. The second boss ramps up the challenge. By this point, the player's nabbed the silver shield from a chest in the shrine and probably feels pretty good about themselves. Wow, I didn't even bother with that third tier of shield, and I got bumped all the way to the fourth. Talk about savings. I'm a consumer prodigy. But the fight has different ideas. Depending on the version you play, you're probably in danger of being stun-locked and brutalized. The post-Windows Ys remakes, from the DS version to Chronicles, ask the player to stay running as he homes in, swinging him around in a circle and staying in range of his torso, taking a crack whenever you can. In older versions, you're meant to guide him around, circle in, and swipe at his tail specifically. This was probably changed in future versions because it's excruciating. Getting a lock on the exact point you need to hit and doing it cleanly feels something like trying to piss your name in the snow. The Sharp version does things a little differently. You're in a pool of water and the boss swaps from diving to jumping. This prevents you from being stun-locked like modern versions and means you only have to ram forward as it's emerging. Mind you, the game's general sense of physicality is lacking, so sometimes you just pass through nothing. A breeze. Like, I'm pretty sure that was a giant centipede demon, but the game says I didn't feel it whooshing by, so I'll be checking into my local psychiatric facility for a psychosis screening. The early bosses are about mobility and precision. The third boss is about feeding you into the wood chipper. It doesn't matter which version of Ys you're playing for the vampire demon. He disappears, he summons a flurry of bats you're made to lead perfectly around the arena, and you either take too much damage or you eventually win. He manifests for a very short time, meaning you need to strike fast and accurately, sometimes only getting a couple hits in, and you're immediately punished because he bursts into his bat swarm in a blink, shredding through your hit points if you go running around. Often it's best to stay put. You can't recover HP mid-battle, by the way, unless you came pre-packing a healing potion. There is no worse feeling in Ys than this. And all while the guitars are screaming. Ah, hell yeah, dude. Awesome. So Ys is intentional about keying the player into the action framework. It's why I called it something like a boss rush game. More importance is placed on these fights as the game goes on, and you don't get anything for free. You know, you can pause the game in DMC and Ninja Gaiden right before taking lethal damage and pop back up to full health with a consumable. That can't happen here. You cannot suck. And tapping directly into that boss rush vibe, most of the bosses are holed up in Darm Tower, 2 in the shrine, 1 in the mine, and 4, counting the final boss, in the final dungeon. Makes sense from a length perspective, but the interesting thing I alluded to earlier is that these Darm Tower bosses are often fought at level cap, or the closest thing the game can produce if it's packaging Ys 1 and 2 together. And acknowledging that, they're intentionally designed to be sharp and painful. No tricks, no cheese, you learn or you die. The Praying Mantis is one of the most consistent fights across all versions of Ys. It's a giant bug that scuttles back and forth while slinging boomerang blades. They home in a bit as they fly, so you have to stay moving. But no big deal, we already learned that. What the fuck? It doesn't matter what tier of equipment you have, some bosses just do damage. This guy doesn't really allow for player error. You sneak in when it's thrown 3 or 4 spinning blades and try to steal as much HP as possible. If you make one misstep, you're practically dead. Ys Chronicles feels a bit better in this way. Most of the versions that bridge Ys 1 and 2 do, because there's still room to grind, to capitalize on the RPG aspect and press on, but the older solo versions can be brutally unforgiving. You can play Ys 1 now via Nintendo Switch, the Egg console version of Ys 1, which allows players to rewind, correct their play in real time, which is admittedly a form of cheating, but I'm glad they allowed the feature. Getting people to care about video games beyond a number score can be a challenge. Getting people to see what I see in games sometimes, because it's a little abstract and high-minded, it can be a challenge. Getting people to play esoteric Japanese language-only video games from the PC-88 era when it has multiple remasters and remakes already? Almost impossible. These are the kinds of accessibility features I value because while they can sort of degrade the totality of the experience, they also make history approachable when it's so often too much for any one person. Now, the rock boss. What do you even say? This guy spits rocks in a circle pattern, which you'd think would incentivize the player to somehow stay ahead of the rocks and stay actively attacking him in a circle pattern. In fact, the sharp version does this best because you have such a free range of movement, and he doesn't shoot many rocks. But it's not always that simple. You can't touch anything but its outer edges in most versions, or else you take rapidly piling damage, meaning you have to lightly skim the thing while it's pelting you with boulders. Shit is highly uncool, my dude. So most versions of the fight devolve into weird, frantic anxiety scramble. However, the Famicom version reimagines the fight, as it so often does, by turning the rock beast into a leaping cyclops that's only strikeable at certain moments, deals heaps of damage, and constantly spits out projectiles in a circle. Would you sit still? This is in the running for most obnoxious Ys battle. You know, people put up memes about the final boss, like, the shittest guy you've never heard of. But that's a technical issue. We'll talk about it. It's amazing to see a single boss battle across 7 versions played range from incredibly obnoxious to pathetically easy. The Twin Heads boss is a little unique. You have the Fire Sword by this point, and you find that you can't just run into either head and deal damage. In Ys Chronicles, only the yellow head with its blue prisms is hittable, so you might make a connection like, Fire Sword only hits the one with floating eyes. This is a weapon-specific thing. It's not. You can fight this boss without the Flame Sword, but the thought crossed my mind, and I kept having that thought as I fought the many versions of the boss in other games. Only one is hittable. Which one is it again? Famicom Ys. What would Ys be without you? Famicom Ys transforms the fight from 2 heads into a large mask encasing a small monster. You wait for the mask to open up, run in, and slap down damage. It's a total overhaul of the concept, though the strands are still there, only damageable at certain times. Projectiles, 2 entities, but only one is damageable. It's the kind of shakeup that normally wouldn't matter, not really, but also does away with the Flame Sword connection. You might never imagine, playing Famicom Ys, that some items are better against some things because the rest of the game doesn't scaffold the concept. This fight is also notably brutal, even stacked against the others, because it's pretty consistently challenging. Those orbs will ravage you, rip through your health like nothing. You cannot afford to stand still. You're tempted, naturally, to run right into the head and deal a ton of damage, but since the heads trade off, swap on strike, you're made to weave in, tag the boss, and pull out. You're denied the repeat strikes you can deal to some of the other bosses, and it turns into a game of endurance, more than most of the other bosses. Some versions are more open to cheese than others. They travel in a predictable pattern, so it's possible to sit in the corner and maneuver just so to hit and weave out without taking damage, but the game is aware it's hard and allows for some wiggle room. The orbs fade away one by one as you break through certain HP thresholds, meaning the fight tacks on more damage up front than other bosses, because it's hard to actually dodge all of the spinning orbs, and becomes more manageable as you fight back. This creates an interesting kind of tug-of-war, where you really feel like you're on the back foot for most of the fight, but rapidly overtake the guy near the end. That's impressive. Seriously, building a narratively satisfying fight progression into a PC-88 boss, telling stories with something as simple as subtraction. Now, before delving into bosses, we were originally talking about Darm Tower. Funny story about Darm Tower. You exit the penultimate boss's room, waltz up to what must be the door leading to the final boss, and open the game. There's an entire teleporting maze behind me. Better than that, there's 2. What is going on? The door is sealed shut and only opens if you're wearing a special amulet. To acquire the amulet in question, the player must approach Ludogema on the 11th floor of 25 floors, by the way, having read all 5 of the Ys books you've found before facing the final boss. Books found in chests after the Rock and Mantis bosses. To read the books, because remember, Jebba translated them originally and you can't leave the tower, you need to find the Bard, Rhea, locked away in the tower's annex, accessible from the 16th floor, the entrance to which is locked behind an evil door that requires the player equip a life-draining evil ring after equipping the blue necklace to prevent the ring from killing you. And the ring is found in the 2nd floor of Darm Tower, accessible just to the right of the first stairwell up Darm Tower. In one version of the game, I never picked up the evil ring, because oops, I went up the other stairwell instead, and therefore never rescued Rhea on my first trip up. So when I went to fight the final boss, I had to backtrack the entire length of the tower, complete that side quest, double back down to loot a gemma, grab the pendant, and climb back up. In another version of the game, I talked to loot a gemma after collecting the books, but forgot to read them, and so in my fugue state, gunning down multiple versions of Ys, I was faced once again with the door to the final boss, and made to climb back down the tower for the pendant, so I could climb back up again and actually finish the game. Ys is not a bad game. In one sense, Darm Tower isn't even necessarily poorly constructed. The game is very short, and nothing is stopping you from quickly backtracking except for rooms with elongated hallways and swarms of highly lethal insects or these fucking mirrors. God, where do I go? It's one of the few moments the game stops and demands you engage with it. Read what the NPCs are saying, right? Buy into the world. It just hurts the same way realizing you need a root canal hurts. Listlessly staring at reality. Ah, yes. This is my fate. Some games have villains named Ganondorf, Dracula, the Devil, Dark Fact. Some versions name him differently. The MS-DOS version says, you know what? Dark Fact isn't working for me. Maleficus. That's a villain name. A little generic, but the gist is understood. Translating some of these names is a challenge, and a name like Dark Fact is bound to cause confusion, so the Master System version calls him Dark Deck. I mean, where do you even start with that? I can see it, actually. I assumed the name was trying to key into the idea of a dark pact, like making a pact with the devil, a Faustian bargain, if you will. But no, Dark Fact. Dark from the Fact family. Their trivia nights are hell. Never go. I have some facts. Some might call them dark facts. Dark Fact is the final boss of Ys 1. He's the mysterious figure who's been stealing everyone's silver. He even kills the fortune teller Sarah. Well, fact, I forgot to mention, when you return with your first book of Ys, she's already dead. It's interesting that you never see or even hear about the guy outside of the occasional mention of a cloaked figure running amok. He lives up to his villain status in that sense. A last minute, wait, who are you? Huh? But you realize what he's done, and he wants you dead, so it's time to make this guy a Dark Factoid. Hey, what the fuck? Dark Fact has a cloak inlaid with Claria ore, which the player may have realized is the significance of the silver equipment.
Claria, the most ancient ore. Some say silver, but the meaning is the same.
So silver equipment, one tier down from the Darm Tower set, is the only way to kill Dark Fact. The game sets you up as an underdog with that little mechanical twist, but you've got your Excalibur, you've got your silver bullet. Let's kill bro.
But no.
Apparently, people consider Dark Fact challenging, which isn't a super fair assessment. Ignore my gaming YouTuberism, okay? I know. It looks bad, but in most versions of Ys, and with minimal knowledge, Dark Fact is easy mode compared to some of the stuff you've been fighting. You just have to trace the arena in a square pattern, making sure to arrive wherever he'll touch the ledge. This is the optimal strategy because hitting him destroys the tile you struck him on, shrinking the battlefield and making the fight significantly harder if you do nothing to mitigate the issue. Swiping at him along the edges, skimming the rim, will keep the field as large and unobstructed as possible, making Dark Fact incredibly simple to fight. Pair it up with the damage-absorbing ring and you're golden. The problem, of course, is the modern PC version. When I opened Ys Chronicles, I got a pop-up asking me to set the refresh rate. 60, of course. That's my monitor's refresh rate. I ain't no hardcore PC fanboy. I don't spend money on expensive squares. Modern Dark Fact seems to have been designed for 30 FPS raw, which isn't even an option in the menu. By the way, if you look at gameplay footage from the PSP version, for example, the original Inception of the Chronicles game, Dark Fact is significantly easier. He shoots far less projectiles. Though I do think that's kind of funny. Maybe Dark Fact really is the shittest guy you've never heard of. Dark Fact, unaltered on a modern PC, is a gateway to shmups and a smashed controller. I didn't realize this Dark Fact, and so I beat him at 60 FPS anyway. Maybe 20, 30 attempts in? Plenty of people enjoy the challenge modes of Ys, scaling up to nightmare difficulty, but I think it's fun and fair how it is. There are already enough artifacts of archaic design coloring the playthrough, no need to put my titties through a twist. Dark Fact vanishes, leaving only his tattered cloak blowing in the wind. We grab the final book of Ys, the Book of Fact, read through the final text crawl expounding on the history of the world, radiant sunlight bathing the scene as the books begin to levitate and glow, circling out all as the scene fades to white and we take in a panning shot of Darm Tower. Hold on. You'll never guess which version I'm about to bring up right now. Famicom Ys decides to tack on an additional ending segment. This particular version of the game has an entirely different take on Darm Tower, even if the broad strokes remain the same. Remember that you never pick up the silver harmonica in this version because Rhea is never seen in Mine. Instead, you collect the evil ring and meet her in the annex like normal, crossing the bridge to the annex that constitutes one of this version's only shots of the land from Darm Tower, by the way, but she doesn't hand you the monocle, limiting you from reading your books. The traditional ending sequence has to be changed then because not only does Ludogema normally hand you the amulet after reading 5 books of Ys, but you need to read the final one with the monocle to initiate the ending cutscene. So what happens? Luda only needs you to rescue Rhea to hand you the amulet, so entering Dark Fact's room works the same. Of course, reaching Ludogema is a pain in the ass because Famicom Ys has a unique set of mirror rooms, easily more frustrating and convoluted than the ones traditionally seen in the game, so backtracking is significantly more obnoxious. You battle it out, but the guy's a fake, an illusion, and you're left alone in the tower. Shortly after, a text box will indicate that laughter is coming from somewhere in the tower. This requires the player to navigate a path in the mirror maze they may not have taken to hunt down and finally kill Dark Fact for real. Couldn't even get falling tiles. Real struggle hours for Famicom Ys. The player grabs the book, and you're instantly warped out of Darm Tower so you can have Jebba read you your bedtime story and we cut to credits. It's a version of events that's somehow true to Dark Fact, being a powerful mage. It's not hard to imagine he could conjure a false version of himself, but it's also more frustrating to actually deal with, and sucks out the epic vibe of the ending, all because one item was removed from the game. Like the removal of a single Jenga brick, fundamentally altering the tower. Of course, different versions of Ys have mildly different takes on this ending. The Sharp version maintains the same structure, but features a different Darm Tower, something that feels out of place in this weird, aesthetically jarring game, because it's really good. Like, most versions of Darm Tower are solemn, a straight cylindrical tower, but here it's twisted and structurally unsound, or at least I'm sure an architect would say that, and it sticks out as the only other aesthetic element truly befitting the Yoshitaka Amano key art, and the vibe of Darm Tower. Dark Fact is a man twisted towards evil. He isn't some innately demonic person, he's the reason demons are roaming the land. And so this one version of the tower aesthetically mimics Dark Fact, something none of the other versions managed to illustrate. Of course, you only see it in the ending scroll. It's not a parent actually climbing through the thing, so it's hard to call it a real artistic win. Ys 1, at least, is pretty limited for story. It's understandable. PC-88 titles were limited in so many ways, and the genre itself, the action RPG, was only then manifesting. A lot of lower-end modern-day video game discussion includes gems like, this new release sucks because the water physics aren't as good as this game from 10 years ago. You know, these fruit textures look bad. Which is the kind of discussion that both fundamentally misunderstands development reality, but also basic concepts anyone can apply to their lived life. Like, I don't know, order of operations? Every game ever was created under some kind of constraint, time, budgetary, etc. And the truth is, the original Ys game was partially created by teenagers, basically children, people who were not being paid exorbitant sums for their experience, but people just then learning and breaking into a then-emerging industry. It's why I like the game so much, having played it so many times. Not the bosses, not the music, it's the charm. It's something that hasn't quite matured. It's got rough edges, but you can see the spark of inspiration regardless. Ys 1 and its sequel get fleshed out in later entries. Major lore reveals recontextualize things established here, and different versions of Ys accentuate the story where older ones couldn't. While the dialogue is pretty simple, no matter which version you're playing, some expand the material. Modern-day remakes include names for NPCs, give them backstories, let you actually talk to them. This isn't one of those everything is worth experience RPGs, right? You can't chat up the nurse and get a level up. You gotta go kill. And adding that kind of feature isn't foundationally game warping, it's just more stuff. You get the sense, playing more modern versions with their character portraits and their voice dialogue, that somebody wasn't satisfied with the simplicity of the game and wanted to expand it. I think that impulse is increasingly justified as the series goes on, though it feels weird here, where the threads are so threadbare, where the game is in perfect focus, leaving so much of the dressing as muddy texture and mystery. Ys 1 is the inception of a decade-spanning series that would eventually develop into something more recognizably action RPG, to modern eyes at least, with recurring characters and storylines and plot-mandated girlfriends. You meet a lot of characters in Ys for how little of the plot is actually impacted by those people. The fortune teller Sarah kicks off the plot, and she shuffles off in record time. But she's still dignified with a portrait, treated as valuable regardless. To be fair, the shopkeeps and pub dudes get portraits as well. Jebba's son, the leader of the thieves, also gets a portrait, and a good amount of text for a guy who tells you to leave the first time you visit, and who opens a door on return. You get the sense that more was planned behind the scenes. Dogi, a recurring character, shows up to break down a wall, hand you a statue, and that's it. He sits in a room of Darm Tower just vibing. You meet the old man, Rabo, through Dogi, and he exists to get handed an item, be rescued, hand you an item, and die. It's small potatoes, but I'm mentioning it because it's possible there's untapped ambition underpinning these characters. It's profoundly weird to have so many names and faces that effectively contribute one small thing, while the player takes center stage every time. The twin blue hairs are eyebrow-raising, though. They dominate various pieces of official art. One of them is presumably the famous title screen orb holder. The track plate is literally called Fina, but in-game, and only playing the first Ys title, the player only ever knows them as Wandering Bard and Girl with Amnesia. You rescue both of them from jail cells at different points.
I knew you had the courage to save me, but to be honest with you, I allowed myself to be caught. I didn't know any other way to find you.
That's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever done for me. They're kind of ethereal, set apart from the other NPCs who tend to look plain, but it's not exactly clear why right away if you only play this entry. You spend more, let's call it quality time with these characters than anyone else on a normal playthrough. In Rhea's case, she plays you a song when you return her harmonica. You battle monsters while escorting Fina out of a cell, take her back to the village, reorients her by leaving her in care of Jebba and the villagers who describe her presence as calming. You even get this little pure scene where she thanks you for what you've done. Though like the jailbreak, it's only found in post-Windows remakes. You get the sense that when it came time to make the thing from scratch, the developers wanted to maintain the core, but expand it in small, sane ways that help flesh this simplistic origin story out. These two characters get an explicit explanation in the sequel, which was likely the intention from the outset, and why the games are so often packaged together. But let's take a minute to look through some other hints about the world of Ys. The 6 books you collect from bosses have names: the Book of Hadal, Dabi, Mesa, Gemma, Tova, and Fact. 3 characters with those names appear in-game. Jebba's last name is Tova, implying that the reason she can read the books is due to her ancient bloodline, which stretches back to one of the 6 priests of Ys, who authored the books in the first place. On that note, Luda Gemma can't translate the books, but he's still in possession of the blue amulet that allows entry to the final sanctum of Darm Tower. To be clear, none of this is deeply meaningful or moving, just little plot threads and moving pieces that Falcom eventually capitalized on over time. And I'm insistent that Ys 1 isn't really about the story because it's so prototypal, still figuring out what its world is, written with that kind of haziness that doesn't know if it's going to exist long enough for a second entry. I mean, this is a game called Ys, and you don't actually visit the place at any point. It's just referred to as a civilization of legend, one that vanished years hence. Consider the contents of the books of Ys. These tomes have official translations, basically whatever you'd find in the modern Falcom-developed versions of the books, which give a basic outline of the civilization's history. The Book of Hadal, the first, starts without offering a description of Ys, chooses to leave the city to the player's imagination, how you might think of Atlantis, and instead starts with the introduction of Claria Or to Ys and the ensuing tragedy, wealth, corruption, idolatry, whatever interpretation you like, brought ruin via demons. all that glitters is not gold. The Book of Tova explains that twin goddesses healed the land of Ys, representing freedom and order respectively, and that their preservation is necessary for the continuation of the civilization. The Book of Dabi names a mysterious he who rose up and rained fire down upon the land, obliterating everything. It blames Claria Ore specifically, and explains that the people buried it, presumably because it could not be destroyed. The Book of Mesa says that 6 great demons hunted the 6 priests of Ys who fled the land in response. The Book of Gemma mostly exists to explain the value of the blue amulet in case the player can't figure out where to go after getting walled off from Dark Fact, and might remember Luda's last name is Gemma, so he might be able to help. The Book of Fact more or less mirrors Adol's defeat of Dark Fact, mentions that collecting the 6 books will unseal the power of Ys and make the collector a guide of some kind. It warns against the power of demons, which begs the question, is the silver equipment dangerous? I needed it to kill Dark Fact, but it's clear that silver, Claria, ruined Ys. Mysteries for the next game, I guess. It's not much for story, mostly offering crumbs, things that would be expanded on many games later, but there's something there. Ys creates a palpable sense of wonder, having various threads but never being able to weave them together. Huge, imposing monsters have access to magic, but almost nobody else. The world itself is stripped. Browbeaten, an abandoned mine, small towns beset by monsters, it feels more like a low fantasy universe suddenly under the threat of the supernatural. It doesn't feel fully fantasy. That tension creates an even greater sense of mystery, and I think it's why different remakes developed specifically by Falcom tap into darker tones and more faded hues. They want to convey the weight and distance of history in a world where a big tree handing you a silver sword is one of the most fantastical events of the game. And I apologize to Ys fans who know the story of 2 and realize how much I'm beating around the bush and how much I'm leaving out of the Ys 1 story in some, but I want to treat each game here as an artifact. One thing that's hard to impress on a viewer watching these different versions bleed into one another is the relative short span of time dividing them. The original Ys came out in 1987, with many of its direct ports releasing soon after, but those were largely identical. Famicom Ys hit shelves as early as August 1988, despite being a total overhaul of the concept. The Sega Master System version launched a few months later. The incredibly faithful TurboGrafx port released near the end of 1989, firstly because it required totally new assets, and because it combined both Ys 1 and 2 together. The Sharp version, the ultimate visual retool, terrified fans in 1991. It took 6 more years until Falcom developed the Sega Saturn version, which keys into the idea of Ys as a low fantasy setting, or currently low fantasy setting, a land in ruin, finally utilizing a freshly muted palette. This is the endpoint of visual direction for the game. The post-Windows remakes also access less than blinding colors and accentuate shadows, darkness wherever possible, and that must have come as a bit of a surprise to fans. Ys was always incredibly colorful, distractingly so, and probably due to development constraints. PC-88 games just look different. The change in visuals is arguably narratively fulfilling and cohesive in a way the older visuals can't quite compete with, but I want to highlight the value of the older aesthetics anyway. Like, I won't go to bat for the OG look. It's fine. It's fine. And the TurboGrafx port made a point of sticking to that bright, blinding vibe. Ys is a fantasy game with upbeat tracks and an ultimately triumphant hero. There's narrative value to color. It aesthetically aligns with the play, if not the setting. The TurboGrafx port was handled by another studio, but unlike the Sharp version, it didn't try to pave over the original vision. It feels more like a high-fidelity remake, at least for the era. As mentioned, TurboGrafx Ys is highly faithful, both visually and in terms of content. What it added was largely aesthetic. Before, any given game would instantly load into the title card and starting would drop you into the center of town. This version instead contextualizes Adol's journey overseas with an opulent intro movie, something to hype the player up and get them invested, breathe life into this thing that was really kind of lacking on that front. It's why people sometimes refer to it as the best version of Ys 1 and 2. It is the original vision, but cranked up, how you might have imagined it if you played the PC-88 version previously. Something as small as having Adol sail in on a ship and being led to the fortune teller immediately sets the tone. gets the ball rolling, and without really upsetting anything about the experience. Like I mentioned, Adol's backstory is delineated in the PC-88 manual, and while Chronicles and other modern remakes tack on as many events as possible, the TurboGrafx port handled it with grace. Aesthetics are important, and small things can alter how we understand something. It's impossible to talk Ys and ignore the music, and specifically its musical tradition. Many words of praise gush from fans in support of the music. It's been called some of the greatest in all of video games. Which I bring up because if you try to source this claim from the sources on Wikipedia, you get an RPG website giving the game's music 85% out of 100. You get someone's blog wherein the poster casually mentions that Ys has some of the greatest music of all time. And maybe even better, you get an interview of Yuzo Koshiro asked why Ys's music popped off so hard, why it's so beloved, to which he answers, "I don't really know." He tries in the interview to link his success to doing whatever he felt would match the scene, which, fair enough. Admittedly, Ys came at a time when technology was rapidly advancing, and for a long time, music from video games sounded mostly like bleeps and bloops. Ys, with its wide range of tracks and pounding rhythms, must have sounded, for lack of a better term, rad. But it is fascinating how much effective storytelling is inherent to this title. Oh, what's that? The MS-DOS Ys soundtrack? Click that shit. I'm not here to confirm or deny that kind of claim. I like the music okay. I think it constitutes a bop. But what I'm actually interested in is the instrumentation. Ys 1 alone accesses a whole gallery of sounds, and not just in terms of fidelity. In some cases, Ys sounds like old era bleeps and bloops. In other cases, Ys sounds kind of moody and kind of fantasy. In other cases still, Ys sounds like something that belongs at a rock concert with wailing electric guitars and pounding rhythms. That's closer to the original intent. Yuzo Koshiro was inspired by rock music more than panpipes, and that rock vibe emerges in multiple remakes. Regardless, I have no idea what the aural identity of Ys is supposed to be. At a glance, the series seems like it should be scored with more traditional fantasy tunes, Final Fantasy type beats, etc. So why is it? The very first time I played Ys 1, I was listening to music that would accompany the baddest of asses. Guitar screaming triumphantly while I flailed around the boss room like a dumbass incapable of landing a hit. It really does impact the experience, makes you feel stupid. Because hey man, you're playing modern Ys. You're probably supposed to know what's going on before playing. I couldn't match the music. I really prefer the lower key versions of the tracks just for tone setting purposes. Ys is aggressive and forward flowing, but that doesn't inherently necessitate electric guitars. The softer and more somber tracks don't overpower the action, they blend in, seem more ambient, suck me into the world better, getting into the dungeon crawling, living in the space. They match the mystique of the world better, and it's interesting that various versions opted for intense action whenever Adol is running. That said, many of the remakes allow players to select which version of the OST they'd prefer. They give players some degree of control over the vibe, let you score your own story. On one hand, that's the nature of a story that's been built on for decades. They had one version of the OST, they had another recorded as a bonus, etc., but it speaks to the spirit of Ys as well. Across all these 7 versions and the many surrounding others, I maintain that there is no single best version of Ys 1. I think many of them have unique value regardless of their total quality, and I'm not interested in weighing them against each other to confabulate some kind of tier list. These games exist as a historical lineage. None of them exist without the original. These different takes are in sum a time capsule of opposing ideas and visions for something that hadn't fully manifested yet, something contributed to by different teams in different places with different perspectives. I appreciate the PC-88 version's crusty simplicity. It set the tone for the entire series. Regardless of whether it's more fun than other versions, it is Ys. I'm fascinated by the Famicom version, which makes plenty of concessions to hardware limitations, but also expands and alters the core content in such a way that it passes for a completely different experience, if not for the specific plot beats that keep it in lockstep with tradition. Famicom Ys is like Ys from another dimension. Like, what if you were purple and had 8 fingers on one hand? Sharp Ys is almost not Ys in terms of aesthetics, monster designs, core mechanics. It's simultaneously easier and harder than other versions of the game in completely unexpected ways that make it refreshing to play regardless. While TurboGrafx Ys is not OG Ys, pinning 2 games together, drawing bigger sprites like the Sharp version, and even altering the introduction, it still feels true to the original vision, and it takes the whole thing to a level of fidelity unseen until later ports. The Sega Saturn version from Falcom itself asks fundamental questions about what Ys is supposed to look like, sound like, play like. It rebrands Ys as something somehow even more palatable to modern newcomers in a way that's still fitting. After all, that's why Ys was made in the first place. The DS version latches onto modern principles established in the most modern versions, but tweaks and adds indiscriminately. There is no need for its additions, it simply put them in, while completely altering the core play conceit. By the way, the DS is the ultimate console to handle bump combat. We've all played TWUI and we all know it's Zenith Gaming. So why couldn't they simply allow peak to happen? The current brand of remake is so far past the original concept, but with all the characters, locations, nouns intact, it's unmistakably Ys. It's closer to the current identity and how most people will probably ever experience Ys 1 and its sequel. I feel a pull to declare Ys is whatever set of things you value most and order the versions by how faithful they are to that property. Ys is bump combat, so the DS version is perverse. Ys is these events, so the Famicom version is disqualified. But the truth is, nowadays, Ys is whatever version of Ys you played. People have this issue where they believe their perception is flawless or counts for something like objective truth, but that's a limited perspective. You only need to dig into perception as concepts to poke holes in the idea. I'll fucking stop! Some people are colorblind and can't see red, so Adol's just a guy. Some colorblind people don't have the same color blindness as others. Beyond color blindness, the number of words for green expands massively depending on what part of the world you're in, because different people have more words and therefore more total precise perceptions of those hues. Language is very much reality, or at least how we codify reality, how we materialize and communicate our understanding. And not everyone is a language expert, not everyone is equally competent at expressing their experiences. So much of what we try to communicate falls apart sheerly because of base assumptions informing our worldviews, relative education, etc. Criticism becomes blind hate, bad faith criticism is championed as legitimate, nobody is bridging the gap. It's impossible to be on the exact plane of existence as any given person. It's why charitability, allowing people to stumble verbally, is so crucial to community. You can't assume they're as bizarre as they paint themselves, or that you have the full picture yourself. Imagine someone trying to say that dark fact is incredibly challenging. People do this frequently. For all intents and purposes, dark fact is incredibly challenging because of the mythology surrounding him. But that isn't true. In most cases, you just follow him around the screen. He's actually something of a vacation compared to the floating heads or the mantis and most of the Famicom version dudes. Bosses that require incredible precision, where dark fact only asks you to copy the broad strokes of his movement. You don't need to dodge all those fireballs, you need to hit him consistently. I one-rounded him in almost every version after Chronicles, but the take is still accurate to my original run, only it was my first experience where I was hobbled by the FPS increasing his difficulty. Hardware reality created this monster, and this concept goes well beyond dark fact. Whole dungeons were easier or harder depending on the version. Some bosses were always challenging regardless. In some cases, I bought into third-tier equipment and other times I didn't, meaning that when I was stripped of my silver gear in Darm Tower, I had a horrible shield at one point and couldn't take many hits. You can outwardly avoid the 5th tier of equipment in most versions and still scrape by. You cannot trust someone's opinion about Ys 1 to be comprehensive because of this. Critically, you shouldn't expect that in the first place. Most people aren't in a position to run a game 7 times. Most people have to do the dishes and the laundry and go to work and pay bills and maintain a healthy relationship with the media they engage with. The entire experience, from stats to bump combat mechanics to experience gain to challenge, depends entirely on the version played. It is multiplicity given form. Ys is a liquid experience. Maybe history can help us think of this more clearly. A lot of ancient history is whatever version we have access to. It's why modern-day historians are increasingly concerned with social history over popular accounts of kings and conquerors. So much of how people actually lived was traditionally ignored in favor of recanting the deeds of the most powerful people alive, people who couldn't possibly represent regular life. And that's before even considering historical bias, that too often the accounts of those victimized by conquerors slipped into obscurity. And so much of ancient history boils down to us, today, relying on whatever some dude said. When we read about Socrates in philosophy class, we're coasting off the assumption that Socrates was a living, breathing Athenian, when our only proof of his words and deeds are the words of his students Plato and Xenophon. For all we know, Socrates might be a fictional character, one of the first recorded OCs. Maybe Plato just imagined, like, a really intelligent guy. Or if Socrates' name was invoked as a trope, the Platonic ideal of a great teacher. We don't know. Socrates exists because of the literary tradition that preserves his memory. If you've never engaged with the series, you might be asking, what the hell is Ys? What is that? That's how you say it? And it's unsurprising. Y and S paired side by side doesn't exactly look like common English. It looks like Ys. It reads like crap. I remember a teacher making the class read a portion of World War II history aloud and hearing otherwise educated kids say slaves when the word printed was Slavs. How you gonna sell a game called Ys in the West? At this point, I've heard Ys and even Ys, and the early games don't help with the problem. Yeah, that's right. Ys. Courtesy of Brazil. Common character names change spellings entry over entry. Luda was often translated as Luther, though it's officially listed as Luda now. Even the protag's name, Adol, just doesn't... Adol, it's so close to English, but so slightly off-kilter it was changed to Aaron and Eric in different versions of this single game. Of course, this is a single North American perspective on the weirdness. If you live in Europe, it's possible you've heard of the mythical city of Ys already. The closest analog I can think of is Atlantis. Ys is an ancient, fictional city, wealthy and prosperous, that's eventually plunged into the depths, its population annihilated, when the dike that prevents the city's submergence is tampered with by the king's daughter for personal reasons, usually so she can sleep with her lover. But instead of opening the city gates with her father's keys, opens the dike in a wine-induced stupor. The king survives, escaping on horse, and is asked by a saint, a disembodied voice in some versions, to cast the demon he's ferrying, his own daughter, into the seas or be destroyed himself. The moral, of course, being women bad. So, not unsurprising we don't hear the story much these days, or at least I've never come across it living in Canada. Of course, this is an old folktale, meaning it's subject to repetition, invention, recreation. In some versions of the story, the king is warned by a saint directly about the city's general debauchery, obsession with wealth, and vanity, and that God is going to punish Ys and its inhabitants. This version arguably ties back to the game best, knowing what we know about the mythical city and its eventual downfall from the stockpile of silver and subsequent summoning of demons. Different versions feature differing takes on when the city was established. In some cases, the king builds the city by the water during his lifetime, and in others, the city was established 2,000 years before his reign, with the land slowly giving way to water as time passed, all undone by the acts of one, dare I say it, unchaste woman. The characters mostly remain the same, or at least adhere to their roles, but the details are smudged, altered over time, in different versions. The city is wealthy and or the city is vain. The daughter is wicked and or the daughter is earnestly in love. And whether the king or the princess hold the keys, they're always made of gold or silver. Ys takes obvious inspiration from the legend, a lost civilization, rich enough to mock God, brought to ruin. And like the story of Caer Ys, the game, or games we've dug into so deeply, are now the product of the oral tradition of storytelling. The mythical city sunken on the coast of ancient Brittany is a story defined by many voices, a folk tale, until it appears codified in a collection of popular songs birthed from the oral tradition. Years after the fact, it's persistently altered from there, taking on new meanings, new variations, with each new version of the tale. And by total accident, propelled purely by the game's success, Ys mimics its own mythological origin.
A tale of souls and swords, eternally retold.
Changing, evolving with new information and in reaction to opposing ideas, shaped by different hands, retold by different mouths, and eventually reclaimed, reconsolidated by Falcom. New context written into this story many games later, the dominant cultural version established years after its inception. And the oral tradition of Ys lives on in how the game is spoken about in forums, social media, and YouTube videos. Dark fact really isn't so bad, but the wiki, the videos, they make it true regardless, as far as anybody cares to know. Storytelling, crafting a narrative, is integral to the human experience, sharing joy. And sometimes that takes the shape of a tall tale. Sometimes the music is good enough to make angels weep, and dark fact is so hard, I smashed my controller. It's possible to fall into ahistoricism, but sometimes the power of a story is more important than the bare reality. Ys became immensely successful, so widely known and respected overseas, and you never know it in the West. They show off new games in Nintendo Switch presentations, and people write mid in the comments. So much of Ys's history is only barely accessible, and even then, using primary sources only really amounts to hearsay. What an old developer wrote on their personal blog, what this person thinks of their own work, what someone else has extrapolated out of some kind of innocuous number score. And maybe covering in this level of depth is trite and indulgent and extraneous, but the scantily preserved history of Ys 1 led not only to a direct sequel, because as we know, video games too often rest at the intersection of art and capital, but a self-interrogating lineage of games, and an entire sordid side history, which, of course, is a series of dark facts for another time.
Hey, it's K-Bash. Huge thanks goes out to my $4 patrons. Check them out. Beautiful. And double special thanks goes to my extra generous patrons who are Adam Welsh,
Air Pirate Sid,
AK, Acropolion,
Alfred Coria,
All the Singularities,
Alpha
42,
Ampersand,
Andrew, Redacted,
Angel Rivera,
Anthony, Aria, Aaron, Arschwasser,
Ashley, my wife, my darling. I asked K-Bash to make you smile. Also, hi, Merrick.
Azrael,
Azura,
Atticure, Axon 8,
Bear Skeleton,
Basement Dweller,
Bosch 7,
Ben M,
Beguile,
Big Papa Spray,
Blake Against the Machine,
Wargle Hargle, Blossom Dante,
Boom Dead,
BH Operator, Born in Shadow,
Brandon S,
Brendan Hesse, British Gooch,
Cow,
Cajun Lady,
Cakesar,
Can I cuss on here?
C-Dub,
Catgirls are real, Caesar T, Hero Hero,
Court Fox,
Cordit, Chris Bromo, Cody Golden,
Comfy Moogle,
Couch Moba,
Crabmonger, Fish Finagler,
Crashgers,
Crater,
Crispy J,
Mono
19D,
Cup of the Puppa,
CW Glassworks,
Denny Pangos,
Danky Steaks,
Swaggy
David
Bag,
Castillo,
Dara,
Dash Granny, Decode,
Deadward,
Dead,
Destrega,
Dingus
Don't
Bat,
read this out loud. Oh no, he did
Doodle
it!
Flu, Doug Prince,
DJ, Professor K,
Dr. Cullen PhD,
Drop the Bass,
the protagonist,
Dylan Winston,
Elias,
Elpio,
Elsa,
Emperor Pickle,
Empty Tenchi,
Eric Monticello,
Excalibur Shines,
Gnar,
Fail Knight,
Burns Maximum,
Fuzillion,
Forte Noir,
Frog Vorbis,
Garen Guaranteed,
Gigglebite,
Glasses Kohai,
Glyph Seeker,
Nine Cat,
Gobo Bobo,
Goose,
6112,
Gray, the darkest black,
Gargory,
Gucci Plant,
Hatsune Miku's Crack House,
Archive,
Demon, Game and Station,
Hermit J,
Hi, Pixie, Hebe,
Honey Mutts,
Horn Tiger,
How do you know?
Huey,
I just took 7 grams of magic mushrooms and now I'm lost in the woods.
I'm supporting K-Bash just because I wanted to make this part of the video longer.
Inferno Galore,
Ingenious Cloud,
IOBG,
PG? I punched a sandwich. It's not bad. It's time to sue. It's not good. Ivy Ruth Langley. Jack Hydra. Jacob. Jalopy. James. Jank Dankins. Jason Lasky. Jaden. James Vaughn. Jay Drito. JL Savarus. Jay Deus. JK Hedgehog. John Bo the Joker. Jordan Joyner. Jorzy Burden. Juicy Frost. June. Kadoken. Kai Zeta Slow. K-Chan. K-Bash's best K. Keegan Too Cool. Keith the Thief. Kata Snack. King Kuma. Keith. Kenite Pike. Clock. K-Noe. Cone 2020. Crazy. Crazy Dark Chocolate. Properton. Ice. Kyle. None. That KZ Excellent. Lady Weed. Laundry Mom. Lego Sid. Lethal Nibble. Linkle. Little Big Trouble. Loadsome Dung Eater. Low Res. Low Fat Moger. Lucas Boy. Blood Mac James. Lunati. Magic Meows. Mama Rollin. Manapool. Manic Pixie Space Pirate. Now Fever. Mara Ganger. Hercules. Marcus Rambles. Maxwell B. Maximum Dog. Meaty Smack. Mechanized Memories. Maple Puppet. Mega Boy E Nasty. Melly 10. Metal Gear Gaseous. Michelle Citrano. Mike DeVere. Mikusagi. Moa. Bobby Dobby. Big Titty Gop GF Queen. Monochrome Only. Monochrome Rainbow. Morgana Black. Mori. Mort. Modi. Mr. Pee Pee Poo Poo Kaka. Mr. Yeety Dabface McYoinkbomb. Mirna. Niranu. Nito Torpedo. Neon Dwarf. Nick Krishnan. Nifty Rex. Not Nobel. Nuggy. Okami. Old Burgle. Old Man Cranberry. Omni Nerd Zero. 137. Only LK. The Plant. Oscar. Paperland. PBK. Pandemic Cowboy. Pelagic Undulation. PK Gaming. Mike. Popular Hitman. Prismatic Dan. Pringle Prongle. Pringle Prongle. Probably not Grady. Project Darklight. Punch Fighter Champion. Honosaurus Rex. Quasar McDougal. Quillworth. Raging Anorexia. Real Beans. Reggie Rodriguez. Renteca Bond. Ringed Relay. Rollets Bowtie. Roylondo. RP Gamer. Ryan Michelle. Saigon Man. Salsa. Salty Smasher. Gabriel. Scribe Slendy. Sakai no Award. Sensual Coder. Saphirium. Sexy Bionicle GF. Josh. Nintendo. Shut up, Wesley. Silver Bear 909. Sin. God! Sir Doodles Alive. Seriously tired of waiting in line. Sir Newton. Sir Slurpsalot. Sir Speedster. Skyward Lead. Sleepy Wabbit. Snart. Small Turtle House. So Zeta Dad. Sock'em Bopper. Suckdolager. Space Lizard. Spider Dad. Squidged. Squishword. Star Night Sky. Streffin Battle. Super Dingus. Super Sandwich Guy. Teotoxin. Shorn Chubbington. Terrence Swift. The Big Bubby. The Clown Prince of Cringe. The Good Lord has blessed me. Hallelujah. The Green Loki. The Crispy Boy. The Peacemaker Pyro. The Salt Knight. The Nomad. The Real McCoy. The Toasted One. Big Dick Mystic. Fresh. Rips Heart. Tiggles McGuffin. Tim Lobster. Timid the Writer. Tony Jones. The Legend. Total Play. Travis Edwards. Whittle Chungus. Ty Guy 9001. Type A Grapefruit. Vid. Vacant Plaza. Valenris. Venom. Vice Pop. Video Gore. Vic. Joaquin, get right in my bag. Waposa. We are so back. Weed Trash. Waylon. Where am I? Help. Whiskey Dono. Widgie. Winter Solstice. Win TV. Wrenchim. Zanny Tanner. Sean D. Stravius. Yero 12. Yashichi. Yay Kundo. Zachary Lives. Zachary V. Zanasso. Zane the Impure. Zane the Pure. Zed Slayer Gamer. Zero Salazar. Zenova. Cyberpunk. If you'd like to help support the show, unlock new long-form projects, and help me keep improving, check out my Patreon. We got lots more videos in store. Stay tuned for more. K-Bash out.